Hey there, you're listening to the Girls Talking Life podcast, and I'm your host, Johanna. If you're like me, you love time with friends. I always leave feeling encouraged, inspired to try something different, or I've learned something new. So why not continue to grow even when we can't be with our girlfriends? We're not made to do life on our own, so in each episode of this show, I'll bring you a girl and her story to give you refreshing ideas to stir your soul. Let's walk this road together. Are you ready to talk life? Welcome to the show. I'm so glad you chose to spend some time here. Yesterday was Mother's Day, and I hope you had an amazing day celebrating your mom or spending time being pampered by your kiddos. But if Mother's Day isn't a time of joy for you, I want to acknowledge that too. We live in a world where everything isn't always as it should be. There's pain and suffering and broken relationships. But my guest story today is a great reminder to seek Jesus in the hardship. Today I'm talking with Sarah Westfall. Sarah is a blogger and a speaker. She is a wife to Ben and a mama to 5 boys. Sarah and I start our conversation talking about our family, what it's like to be a boy mom, and we talk about raising our kids up to be the men and women we want them to be. And we might talk about how we'd like to have arranged marriages for our kids. Sarah and I go on to talk about the pregnancy and birth of her second son, Carter. About halfway through her pregnancy, she and her husband were given the unimaginable news that their son would not survive after his birth. Sarah walks us through their journey and describes how God showed up for her in the most profound ways. Sarah shares how God continued to give them grace and mercy and how her healing process began. Her story is painful and unexplainable, but she has chosen to glorify God with it. And whether you're a mom or not, there has been or will be loss and pain in your life, and Sarah does such a good job at pointing us toward Jesus in hardship. Here's my conversation with Sarah. Hi there, Sarah. Thank you so much for being a guest on Girls Talking Life today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
You got your coffee? And I've got mine.
Absolutely. Yes, it's a necessity.
So we can get started with our conversation. Do you want to just tell me a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background and your family?
Yeah, we are in Indiana. So my husband and I have been married. It'll be 15 years this summer. That feels like a much bigger number than what we feel like it is, in a good way. And then we have 4 boys at home with us, ages 9, 6, 3, and 2.
Wow.
Yeah. Yep. And my husband is actually currently out of town until I have 3 more days, something like that. So I'm really feeling that 4 versus 1 dynamic at the moment.
Bet.
My husband is a businessman, enjoys all things entrepreneurship and community development. And then I am a writer. I work from home. And so I try to manage the balance between shooting the gaps of nap time and working. I also do some editing on the side. So just kind of have my foot a little bit in that publishing world one way or another.
Very nice. So
Yeah.
My husband and I are also about to celebrate our 15-year anniversary.
Yay!
Yeah, so
Congratulations.
You mentioned to me in our initial communication that you have almost 7,000 unanswered emails or unread emails.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, Sarah?
Yeah, I love to consider myself an organized person, but when you look at the data, when you look at the 7,000 unread messages, and most of those are from Gymboree or Old Navy,
Okay,
and so they're not. It's
shopping
advertisement.
email.
It is. It's like the stuff I need to go back and unsubscribe, but I have just not taken the time to do it, and so they sit there.
Okay, well, that makes me feel better. You told me that.
Okay,
and I was sweating for you a little bit.
No. If it was friends who had been emailing me, oh my word, that would make me sweaty too.
Okay. And we also found out that we are both INFJs from the Myers-Briggs type indicator, so I feel like we already have a super big connection.
We do. That's why we both have our coffee, and this one-on-one dynamic works very well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you are in Indiana, and I shared with you that for a really short time, we lived in Northwest Ohio for about 6 months of our early married life before kids. And I drove a little under an hour into Indiana to work every day. So we also have that.
Yes, the Midwest. Gotta love it.
Right, right. But I feel close to you in, our personality type and then close to you geographically. So welcome to the show,
Right.
Sarah.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and to get to know you a little better and just have a nice little coffee chat.
So as you mentioned, you have 4 boys at home. I think you have 2 in school and then 2 at home with you.
Yes, correct. So the older 2 are in first and third grade, and then my younger 2 are 2 and 3. So they're very much not in school.
So I am a mother to 2 girls, and I think that I always knew that was kind of my path. And thinking of 4 boys, young boys, that makes me a little nervous. Tell me how do you do that? How do you manage life and how does it work for you?
Oh, that is a good question. It is not like if, say, 10 years ago when we started having kids, I would not have said, yes, I want to be a boy mom. I always pictured myself with a little girl with American Girl dolls and the clothes and all the things and painting our nails. So it's not something that I was like, yeah, I really want this for myself or I foresee it. But now that I am very deep in it, I can't imagine being anything but a boy mom. And it's really most days managing chaos and burning energy is, I feel like, what my job is, that there's a lot of energy. And praise Jesus that our weather is finally changing so that that energy can go outside and run around and explore and sleep a little bit better at night. And so yeah, that's how it is managed most days. And my husband is great. He's a really active, present father, and so we partner together pretty well in both investing in our kids, but also like recognizing when the other person is like really feeling it as a parent, feeling a little run down and saying, maybe you need to go get some coffee and step away for 30 minutes or whatever. That's probably my go-to. But so yeah, it's a partnership. And so I don't know. I think, when he travels and I have to solo parent, I'm very grateful for his active presence when he is here. So
it's a nice reminder that he picks up that burden for you. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, I do have girlfriends with sons and they're darling. And I admire the relationship that they get to have with their little boys.
Yeah. And one thing too, like with the boys, I think of you with being a girl mom, and I think like, okay, so my boys, I'm training them to grow up into men, right? I try to have this long-term view of not necessarily the behaviors and the choices they're making now, but that long-term view of the men that I would love to see them become. And yes, in their faith, but I feel like a lot of that is God's job. But even just in their capabilities as boys who will become men and being able to do things like laundry and how, like yesterday I had a conversation with my older 2 about, they had a lot of questions about dating and when they could date and whether they could kiss girls on dates. And so we had a lot to talk about and about how you treat a girl and, had to navigate because they're just very clueless about girls because they don't have a sister.
Well, they're 9 and 6, right?
Yes. And even at school, like
early.
Yes, that is very early. And so I'm trying to set a lot of groundwork now for this is how we interact with girls and this is how we treat, and a lot of it's just how we treat humans, but also in just helping them navigate we are on the cusp of puberty, and I know it. And so trying to be a little bit proactive in that regard with them because it's coming.
Well, that makes me feel so good because I have one in puberty and I just...
Oh, bless it.
Yes. But when I think about her and, raising her up to be the woman that I want her to be and thinking about her finding a boy that's on the same path as her, that kind of makes me nervous. And so I'm so glad that you are out there as an example of someone who's considering that for their boys.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Maybe we should, arranged marriage is starting to sound like a little bit better of a thing.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
don't think I'm just kidding. Not really. But yeah, some days it's like, could we just make an agreement now?
Yeah. Let's just pick your partner.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So you are parenting 4 boys, like we said, but you are mama to 5 boys.
Yes.
So I want to go back and talk about your little boy, Carter.
Yeah.
Let's see, you and your husband got married, I think you said in college.
Yeah. Oh man, it's like I was an infant. I had turned 21 6 days before we got married. And
Wow.
so it was between my sophomore and junior year in college.
So
So yeah,
did you meet him in college or were you high school sweethearts?
short story, he was in a band and I was a senior in high school. He had taken a year off between his freshman year in college and his sophomore year in college to be in a Christian rock band, which lasted about 4 months. And so when we met, he was actually working at Walmart and I was senior in high school, and we started talking and getting to know each other. And once I discovered that his path was kind of leading him back to college and that our colleges would be nearby, yeah, we started dating. So it was in that summer between my senior year in high school and college.
And things went well. You guys ended up getting
Yeah.
married while still in college, which I think just sounds super
Yeah.
challenging.
I think because we were at different universities and we spent so much time trying to coordinate when to see each other, that when we just knew that we would come home and be together in the evening, it just simplified everything. And there was no longer the question of, oh, is he the right one? Isn't he the right one? Like managing all that dating drama,
Yes.
because we were married and it was just done. And he was my one because, it was done. And so it just worked out for us. That is not the case for, like, I've had girls come to me since and be like, oh, my parents don't want us to get married and we're in college and all these things. And like, I am not one to be like, you should do it for everybody.
Yeah.
Definitely listen to the wisdom of the people around you. But we got lucky that it worked for us.
And since you did get married when you were babies still, you
Yes.
waited 5 years before you started having kids yourself.
Yeah, we did. We knew that we wanted, as much as what was in our power to wait a bit until we had kind of established ourselves and really given our marriage some time to marinate and work through some of that, getting used to each other that happens early on in marriage. So
Yeah, that's a
we
huge
were
adjustment.
glad that, yeah, it is. So we're glad that we are able to have those years pre-kids. They seem like a lifetime ago now, but yes, we were very grateful for that.
So you had your first son, Cohen. Was that a
Yes.
normal pregnancy, healthy baby?
The pregnancy was normal, very, very sick through it. But I mean, that's the story with a lot of people.
Yes.
His delivery was very challenging and he had to end up it was just really long and he just was not wanting to come out. And so he ended up also having some transition issues like with his lungs. And so he was in the NICU for about 6 days after that, but nothing that was huge red flags,
Okay.
that we were concerned about with having more kids.
Okay. So not long.
Yeah, Cohen he was at that like delicious 10-month-old baby phase. Like he wasn't really walking and he was just so pudgy and perfect and like sleeping finally,
Yes.
through the night. And so you're like, this is so great. I want more. And so we started trying, when Cohen was about 10 months old. And we're really surprised that we got pregnant again kind of right away. And again, all things pointed to normal pregnancy. Baby's heartbeat was good. I was less sick with this one, which was wonderful.
Mm.
And life was pretty normal. It seemed real textbook. And so then about midway through the pregnancy, you go in for your ultrasound,
Mm-hmm.
finding out whether we were so jazzed up about finding out if it was a boy or a girl. And we went in, and our doctor was having a hard time deciphering whether it was a girl or a boy because I was really low in amniotic fluid. Our doctor wasn't overly concerned in that moment because he just kind of wanted to monitor what was happening. Baby, again, heartbeat was good, movements were good. And so he asked us, just come back in a couple weeks. We're going to do another ultrasound and we will see what's going on. So even at that point, it wasn't on my radar that anything was necessarily wrong. I was honestly just really disappointed we didn't know it was a boy or a girl. And so, we had to text all of our people and, had to say, well, we still don't know.
Yeah.
And so put a pin in that. And 2 weeks later, came back and did another ultrasound. And again, my amniotic fluid levels that, and for those who haven't been through pregnancy and or childbirth or haven't been around it, that amniotic fluid, when you look at an ultrasound, is that black area surrounding the baby. It's what in the mother's womb kind of adds that cushion, that layer of protection between the outside and inside world. And also it's kind of what the baby ingests when it is practicing breathing in and out. And it helps the baby develop lungs, healthy lungs, also source of nutrition, all these things. And so mine was very low, almost non-existent at that point. And so the doctor was very clearly concerned, but looking back, I kind of wish I would have asked more questions. I knew he was concerned and I knew this wasn't normal, but I didn't ask any questions and I don't know why I didn't. So he sent us to a specialist down in Indianapolis, a neonatologist, where they would be able to do a more in-depth ultrasound.
You're about halfway through your pregnancy at this point?
Yeah, it was closer to the I think we were close to 28 weeks about that point. So it was getting farther along to that third trimester. And I'm not good at math. I might have been in the third trimester. I don't know. So we went down. It was December 23rd. It was 2 days before Christmas. So, in the back of my mind, I'm nervous about this appointment, not really knowing. I was preparing myself for, I'm going to have to be on bed rest, or they're going to have to do some type of amniotic infusion, or worst case scenario in my mind was where they would have to do some type of procedure to the baby while inside the womb. And then would have to go on bed rest. And so that was my worst case scenario because I was trying to think, how do I do this while still having this? Let's say he was about 14 months at the time, a toddler.
So you're thinking, how am I going to do bed rest? How am I going to do the holidays probably?
Yes. So that's where my mind was. But even then it was okay, we can do this. I've got this. Kind of preparing myself for, I'm a planner. And so I was trying to, in my head, work out okay, scenario A, scenario B, scenario C, and how that would work. But when we got to the hospital, we met with they had a special ultrasound tech who ushered us into a room, and it was almost like a closet. It felt so little and dark. And she began checking the baby and doing the ultrasound and just fell silent. Previously had been very perky and, hey, how are you? All these things, and just went quiet. And so in that moment, my heart just started racing. That anxiety just really started building up in my chest. And she kind of slipped out and said, I need to go get the doctor. Came back with the neonatologist, who went right to the ultrasound machine and started looking at it for herself. And she put down the equipment that she was using, turned and looked at me. She kind of I was sitting up on one of those doctor's tables, exam tables. Mm-hmm. My husband, Ben, was seated next to me. And she kind of sat down on a chair right in front of me. So she was a little bit lower, put her hands on my knees, and she said, your baby doesn't have kidneys. And while your baby is fine and living and breathing and kicking while inside the womb, he cannot sustain life after birth. And she went on to explain all of these things and what it meant and how, it's a condition called bilateral renal agenesis, in which neither kidney forms. And if he had had one kidney, it was probably survivable. But without two kidneys, it just wasn't. There was no amount of procedure that could have been done before or after he was born. And I just remember in that moment, like, she continued talking and saying all these things, but I literally floated up on top, like over the room. I'm looking down on what is happening. My husband is sobbing, just immediately devastated. And I'm kind of like in this numbed, shocked state where I'm just kind of nodding at the doctor and not crying, not anything, just looking at her. And I'm like floated up outside myself and looked down, and I was just like, this is not my story. It was not on my radar. I had done everything right, pregnancy wise, taken all the vitamins, not eaten the lunch meat, all the things we do.
This wasn't one of your scenarios. You hadn't planned for this.
No, this wasn't even scenario Z. It just was not on my radar. My mind immediately flashed back to, and this seems really kind of trite, but this episode of Grey's Anatomy where this woman has to deliver, and she knows it ahead of time, but has to deliver her stillborn son, and the grief that she went through in knowing the outcome, that there was not joy on the other side. And I just remember telling God, like, I cannot do this. And as I was processing, trying as best I could to process that information, I just remember this very clarifying moment before we left the hospital that day of saying, God, you either need to be everything that you say you are, or I cannot do this. And that's kind of how I left it, leaving the hospital that day, of just very clearly at the end of myself.
So everything changes. You have a relationship with this baby that's pretty far along. You have plans. You have a lifetime of plans for this baby that you've, been developing over the last several months. What do you do from here? How do you spend the rest of your pregnancy?
Well, we immediately went into Christmas. We had plans that day, like, we were going to leave the hospital and go home and get our other son and head to family's house. And we did. And that Christmas, and really every Christmas since, but especially that Christmas, was just incredibly raw. But I was so grateful to be surrounded by family in that moment of just the most intense grief, the loss of the vision that I had of, like, my boys playing together, just all the things that I had pictured of what our family would be. And, summers on the playground and vacations and just all the things, the normal family stuff.
Yeah.
And so had to, first and foremost, like you said, grieve the loss of that dream, of that vision. And being in the Christmas holiday and being surrounded by family was such a blessing, because being an introvert, like we talked about earlier, you and I can have a tendency to want to withdraw, kind of slip inside myself. But being around family kind of helped me not just lose myself in my grief, but also it was so good to have helping hands with our toddler when we needed to have a moment, when I needed to go down to the basement and just lay on the floor and sob. I had people who could, and that happened multiple times.
I would imagine.
Yeah, I had people who were going to take care of my other baby. And so it was a very difficult, but even looking back, it still had some sweet moments of those. It was about a week or two that we were with family immediately after, because it was really hard returning home.
Yeah.
Because that was kind of like our home. Our house where we were living at the time was where I had envisioned, that next stage of family life. And so being there, it was even more evident of what we were losing.
So you have a few more months, or maybe a month and a half. You go in to
Yeah.
deliver him in February of 2011.
Yeah. After I'd gone through that initial loss of that vision, God kind of helped speak into my heart through a variety of ways, but saying, this is your time with your son. We were given the option to finish the pregnancy early, which in my mind was never an option. And so we kind of breezed right past it. And it wasn't until later that I was thinking, even years later, that I was like, oh my word, like I was given this option. But looking back on it now, and even in the midst of it, like that was my time with my son. And there's these just sacred moments that I had with him while in the womb, like one that even lingers today. And it's a practice that I have now, is taking a bubble bath. And at the time, like I would take a bubble bath and I would, my big old pregnant belly was clearly not covered by bubbles.
Mm-hmm.
And I would put my hands on him and on my belly, and I would sing, or I would talk to him. I would do the things that I would not be able to do after he was born, because this was my time to be a mom to him. And so, I would sing and I would put my hands on, and I'm not a good singer, but so it was probably good that he had that, he was inside and didn't get the full effects of that. But I would sing to him and he would wiggle and he would squirm. And because I didn't have that amniotic fluid, his movements were so much more pronounced. Like I felt everything. And sometimes it was really painful because he would jab me in places that normally babies wouldn't. But overall, it was just this bittersweet, beautiful, sacred thing. And God just met me in it. When I asked God, I said, you either have to be everything you say you are, or I'm done, or I can't do this. He was. And not just in helping me like survive, but in an abundant type of way. Like I felt like God's nearness, like I didn't even know possible. And I had a relationship with Jesus since like a little girl. And the God that showed up in that was even more full and fabulous than I ever could have imagined. And so I kind of just started pouring myself into the book of Psalms, reading his promises, remembering his promises, but also resonating with the suffering and the anguish of the author of Psalms and how God met him in that. And so just kind of kept pulling my heart back to truth. And it just became like, even though it was such a devastating time, it was also really, really beautiful in the ways that God showed himself in different circumstances. And even just in that quiet alone time, I used my toddler's nap time just to kind of stop and be with God. And some days I would nap because sometimes that's a spiritual thing you need to do.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes really I would just be with God, and in a way that I hadn't before, and just being really raw before him, really saying all the things, all the guilt that I felt, all for certain thoughts I would have, or the struggles, or the anger that I would have, and just really letting him have it. And he took it and softened it. And, it just met me in that place of brokenness. And it became a very sacred thing.
I'm sure you had the question of, why is this happening to me?
I did in the sense of, I felt, because initially I had to work through this, like, it's not fair thing, because, God, for whatever reason, leading up to even that point in my life in my mid-20s, like I still had this mentality of, if I make the good choices, good things will happen to me.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until we were going through all of this that God had to kind of unravel that. Because when I asked, I remember very clearly once asking God, why me? And the response I heard back, and not in an audible voice, but like in my heart, was, why not you? Like, what is it about me as a human that makes me exempt from hard things, that makes me exempt from suffering, So I had to honestly let go of some pride and let go of some entitlement issues that I had, and probably can still, even to this day, continue to work through with God, of thinking that I am deserving on some level. And this is the part that gets a little, I never felt like it was the right prayer to pray that God would heal my son. And I had a lot of people. My husband worked in a church at the time. We were surrounded by great family, a lot of people who were praying just for miraculous healing. And I was grateful for them for that. But I just, in my own personal time with God, I didn't feel like that was how I was supposed to pray. Because what kept coming to mind is, if Carter, his short little life, is more impactful and more glorifying to God than a long, full life, 80 plus years, then who am I to question that or ask God to change that? And so I just continued to pray that God would use it. I had said, this is not my story, but God, as you are clearly writing it, that it would just be, that the ending would be you. And so, because in my mind too, I kept thinking of, Abraham with Isaac, and even God with his own son. And I'd say, if God sacrificed his own son and let go of his own son, then why shouldn't I?
What a great example.
Well, yes, of God, not of me.
What a great example for you to be able to look at and say,
yes,
God made the sacrifice.
Yes. And again, it goes back to that, why not me? I am not exempt from suffering and from letting go of things that I really, really want and have dreamt about. And so I had to just pray that prayer, not always because I wanted it and believed it, but because I knew it was the prayer that would not only bring the outcome that God desired, but that was going to change me and help me change my perspective.
So brave of you.
It did not feel brave at the time.
So you go to deliver your baby. Do you have a time limit from the doctor? Have they given you, this is what's going to happen once he's delivered?
Yeah. Well, we knew from the doctor that it would probably only be a few hours at most. And there was a huge chance that he would still be stillborn, because of his condition didn't allow him to undergo that normal fetal development. And so his lungs were very underdeveloped. And like I talked about earlier, how the amount of space he had inside the womb, he was pretty cramped. And so there were a lot of factors working against him in order to even be born alive. So my prayer became that I would just have some time with him outside the womb. And actually, as I was writing about this experience in the last year, I was looking back at old journals, and I read through a prayer I had written to God of, God, if I could only have an hour, and very specifically said an hour. And when Carter was born, that's what we had. And looking back, I was kind of like, man, I wish I would have asked for a little bit longer. If God was really listening, maybe I should have said I should have been a little bit more generous, right? But it was very cool looking back and seeing God's faithfulness. It was so tiny of a prayer, I didn't even remember it. So we went into labor with Carter. So we were supposed to go down and deliver in Indianapolis with the specialists down there. Mm-hmm. And of course, we live in the Midwest, and it was winter and had one of the absolute worst ice and snowstorms, blizzard level, that we had in years. And so the day before, I had gone to a checkup with my OBGYN, and we were still 5 weeks away from his due date. And so I asked the doctor, just kind of jokingly, hey, what happens if I go into labor, during this thing? And so he's like, oh, I'm around, but I'm sure it'll be fine. All these things. But of course, in the middle of this, my water breaks. And clarification, when your water breaks, it is that amniotic fluid. So it was very, very minimal. And so at first I didn't even know really what was happening, because it wasn't super like what you see in the movies. It wasn't
Right.
this like flood happening. We went in, and in the middle of this, and we were so glad that we had family all our family was within about 2 hours. And some of them, it took like double that to get there, but they were able to get there. And Carter was born on February 2nd, 2011. And we had an hour with him. The only way I can describe that hospital room and that time was holy ground, because the presence of God was so thick that I almost was like looking for him among the faces of the family who were there, because it was just, he was so real and so close.
And that's what you asked him. You said you have to be
Yeah.
everything that you say you are.
And he was so close. And the fact that all of our family and friends were there, our pastor at the time happened to just live down the street from the hospital. And in the middle, he couldn't even get his car out, but he got out of his house, put on a coat, and runs through this blizzard to get to the hospital. And he baptizes Carter and says a prayer over him. And Carter got to be, while he was still breathing, passed around to Ben and I both come from families of 4 kids. And so all of our siblings were there, some of their spouses, both of our parents, and everyone got to hold him. Carter experienced more love in that hour than so many people do in a lifetime. And so it was just like, my heart was at peace, and I could not explain that. In that moment, there was just, my heart, it was just at rest. And I got to enjoy that hour with my son while everyone was still gathered around the hospital bed. And Ben, my husband, was holding Carter at the time. And the nurse kind of was quietly slipping in and out of the room, kind of checking his heartbeat, seeing how he was doing. And she came in, and Ben was holding him, and she checked him, and she kind of just gave me that look like, he's passed.
Yeah.
And I found it to be such a beautiful moment that he was being passed from his father's arms here on earth into that of his heavenly Father. And we didn't announce it to the family. We didn't announce that, he had died, but just kind of continued to let the presence and the peace of God just kind of exist there for a bit. But about probably 10 minutes after that, then everybody kind of cleared out. They knew.
Yeah.
So then after that, I had kind of gotten settled, and Ben was able to get Carter cleaned up and dressed in the outfit that we had picked out for him. We just spent some time. We knew he wasn't there, but we weren't ready to let him go. And so we just spent some time as best we could, like looking at his little toes and trying to like memorize.
Yeah, capture all that.
Yeah. And so we spent probably a couple more hours just trying to soak in as much as we could. But there came a point at which it became very obvious that death had happened. And his physical features began to shift and change. And I didn't want to remember him.
Yeah.
I wanted to remember him with life and not with death. And so we called the nurses, and we said, okay, it's time. And so the nurses took him away. And that was the moment. If I thought that discovering the news that our son would die was hard, what was even harder was tangibly handing him over, knowing that I would not see him again in this life. And, God gave us a lot of grace in the days that followed, both physically, emotionally, because we ended up having a service for him at our church and a burial. And, I had just given birth. And so physically, I should not have been able to probably do all the things that I did, traveling and such. But God gave us a lot of grace in that, because we wanted so desperately, even though we were hurting so bad. Ben and I were still very expectant that God would continue to show up in those spaces, in his memorial service and at the cemetery. And so we continued just to counter our grief with looking for God and how he would show up in those places. And he did, of course, because he's God. I think the hardest point for me was those 3 months after he died, the 3 months of feeling the intensity. And it was very soon that it was like Mother's Day, pretty soon after that. And never was I more aware of the child that I was without. Like even physically, my body said, where is your baby?
Right.
Because it was responding to the fact that like all the hormones and the things that your body does after you have a baby. And even my arms, like I remember my arms physically aching to hold a baby and just feeling that absence. So those first 3 months were very, very difficult. If I'm being completely honest, like I even, after giving birth, it's not uncommon for doctors to prescribe some type of narcotic just to help with for a short amount of time to help with the pain from labor and delivery. And with what my doctor had prescribed for that, it made me very sleepy. It made me very like kind of drowsy. And what I ended up having to give the bottle to Ben and say, you have to take this away because I want to take it for the wrong reasons. I want to take it to escape from my hurting and not because I'm physically, because I wanted to forget and to just drift away. But I knew that would be dishonoring not only to God, but to my son. And I didn't want to do that.
So unimaginable loss, Sarah. I can't imagine. I can't put myself in your shoes other than listening to your story. And it sounds like you had some really beautiful moments where God showed himself to you and just had such mercy and grace. And you go home and you have these hard 3 months. And I mean, anyone would. That's not unique after such a sad loss when you thought you were going to go home with your son at one point during the pregnancy and then you don't. So what do you do after that? How do you pull yourself back kind of out of that grief and come back from the loss?
Yeah. I really think it took a full year because, that first year, there's all these firsts. The first Mother's Day without him, or all these should have beens. We should have been celebrating, he should have been getting teeth, or he should have been like, it's all these firsts. And with each of those came this new wave of grief. So the first entire year was hard, but I think what was very helpful for me to not just get buried in the sorrow was two things. First is that I accepted a position as a resident director at a university and started to serve and to love the girls who lived in my residence hall. So we also moved from the house that we were living in. And honestly, I think that was so cleansing because I felt like, I don't believe in ghosts, but I felt like it had ghosts of the hurt that we had been through. And I needed to be in a house that wasn't haunted by those in order to move forward.
Yeah.
I needed it. I needed a new chapter of that story. And so my graduate degree was in student development, counseling, and administration. And so I decided that it was time to put that to use in being able to live side by side with the women who are living in my residence hall and do life with them and lead the RAs and the other girls on staff was just a joy. And as much as I would love to think that I impacted their lives, it was really the other way around because it brought so much healing to me to be alongside them in their lives and the struggles that they were going through and be able to, on a very deep level, relate to the hardships that they were facing and the joys too, and the questions they had about God and all the things that, even it's very common for college students to experience anxiety, depression, all of these mental, emotional health things, and things that I knew all too well, and was able to have a lot of empathy and compassion that maybe I wouldn't have had before going through some of this. And so it was a really good time of healing. And then from there, I took a similar position down in Tennessee at a state university. And again, the same type of experience. And I found in there what was probably most healing for me. I mean, we're talking, my healing process has taken, and not to say I'm fully healed, I think I'm always going to walk a little wounded. But I think what happened when we lived in Tennessee is that I found this group of friends in which I was able to really be raw and real and truthful with. And it was just a really good community that I hadn't had before on that level. So I found a lot of healing in just being with God's people and being more comfortable with the story I had been given and giving that back to God with very open hands. So that, because my heart, in the wake of all this, is that God's presence was so near and he was so abundant that I want everyone to experience that. I want them to know that he is more than enough, in all things, even when we don't see it. And as much as I would love to have my son here, the grief that I experienced has become God's deepest grace in my life. And I never would have thought, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say what you've told me. You said my journey with grief has become God's deepest grace in my life. And you also say that this experience has been a catalyst for so much change. What kind of change have you experienced?
Oh, glory. You know how with dates, there's before Christ and then how we do that timeline. I feel like I have this very clear before and after. A couple of major things have changed for me. I mentioned earlier that I had this pride, thinking that if I do good things will happen. And I kind of had to rewrite my definition of good things, because good is not always easy. Those things do not necessarily, equal out. And while grace is a gift, sometimes gifts are what we need and not what we want.
Yes.
It's like Christmas morning when we get the socks instead of the rollerblades or something, which a rollerblade's still a thing. I don't even know.
They are, yeah.
Okay. And so that's one of the main things, is having to rewrite my definition of good and of grace. A friend of mine, actually in Tennessee, once said that God tastes best in brokenness. And I can attest to that I tasted a God that I didn't know was possible. His intimacy and his closeness and his care about the tiny little things in our lives. And so I want to have that in my day to day. That when I feel like things are celebratory and beautiful and, the sun is shining, I want to see God in that. I want to know his nearness in that. Or whether things are broken and hurting, I want to see him in that. Or whether it's just a Tuesday and I'm doing the dishes
Right.
and the laundry and everything is ordinary and mundane, I want to see him in that. And so I think that the biggest lasting effect for me have been those two things, of wanting to rewrite my definition of what's good and what is grace, and wanting to see and experience God in the different things that life brings, knowing that he is just as near.
What would you say to someone who has just gotten some devastating news or is in the, 3 months after? What would you say to someone there?
Two things. One, let yourself grieve. Let yourself feel the immensity of your hardship, of your pain, because it isn't until we know the heaviness of our pain, how much we are not enough, that we see just how big God is and just how far he will reach to pursue us. And so not be afraid of going there, and being raw before God, because I think sometimes we have this tendency to feel like we need to move on. I mean, there's, all the different stages of grief, and I understand that, but like letting ourselves go there, because it's not too far gone for God.
Mm-hmm.
But then also kind of hand in hand of continuing to just ask God to show up, whether that, and for me, that was, I read like one Psalm a day, and I journaled, and I was just raw before him. God promises, in James, I think it's 4:8, talks about if we draw near to God, he will draw near to us. And so whatever drawing near to God looks like, for that person, just do what you can to draw near to him, and he will come near. And maybe a third thing that I'm kind of just thinking about now is that sometimes when we feel like God is not close, because I have had these seasons of feeling like God is not close. I'm a feeler. I'm an Enneagram 4. So life is what I feel. Sometimes when I don't feel that, it is in the waiting, it is in the silence that God is doing something very important in me. And so still trusting God that even when I feel like he is absent, that it is for my best. And so that's where then the filling our hearts and our heads with his promises becomes really important. That even if I don't feel it, that rationally I can look at it and read it.
And I love what you said about the journaling and going back and remembering, oh yeah, I asked for an hour and that's exactly what I got. I forget so many things, and just to take the time to think through what happened, or to have it in a journal and review that and just be like, this is how big God is.
Yeah.
All of these things that he's orchestrated.
Yeah. It's been so beautiful going back. And, last year I was working on actually writing out our story and had to go back through a lot of that. And some of it was very, very hard because I had to re-experience things that I hadn't let myself re-experience in the last 8 years. But it was very therapeutic. But it was also, like you said, being able to see that faithfulness of God from then until now, and just still knowing that he is still good, so good and kind to us.
Well, you went on to have 3 more healthy boys to fill your house.
Yes. My husband's testosterone must be very strong because, yeah.
Sarah, what's next for you? What are you working on now?
Yeah, well, writing has always been something that I've loved doing in some capacity. I had a blog that I used during our once we found out with Carter, kind of through that first year. So I blogged through that, and then I've kind of dabbled in a couple blogs since then, but nothing really felt right. Like I did the mom blog thing for a while, and while I love being a mom, it just wasn't like my whole heart. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't where I felt what I wanted to write about, because, all these other things that God had been teaching me about his goodness and grace and suffering and hardship, like that was really what got me fired up. And so let's see, early this year in February, I relaunched my blog. It's under my own name. It doesn't have a fancy title or anything like that. But just to write about a lot of the things that even you and I have talked about today, exploring kind of that intersection of faith and life, but seeing God in the beautiful, the broken, and, that everyday in between space. I write regularly there, as well as contribute to a few other outside sources. But my kind of big project that I've been working on is a book kind of telling our story and telling the reflections that I've had out of that. So now I'm at a stage where I am hoping to think about publishing. If anyone's listening and wants to publish my book, hit me up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sarah, at the end of the show, I like to ask all my guests for their favorite 5.
Yeah.
What are 5 things you are reading or watching or eating or wearing that you want to share with us?
Goodness. I have a hard time narrowing it down, but I will try. I think I mentioned earlier, right now, we are just in Indiana, like on the cusp of spring. Mm-hmm. And so I am loving the spring weather outside. I think mostly because I get to send my boys outside and they get to run around. But also just the sunshine. It's good for the soul. Another thing that is one of my favorites right now, and it kind of has been for a while, but like really religiously right now, is bubble baths.
Mm.
When my husband isn't traveling, probably almost every night between when we get our littlest two in bed and then when all the kids are in bed, I try to take a bath and read just something I want to read. And it has been good self-care at the end of a day, but it's also been really good for our marriage because I have this buffer between being needed by kids all day, but then my husband also wanting some time and attention. And not in like a need the same way as my children, obviously.
Right.
But like I want to be able to be just as present with him. But I, being an introvert, I like have to have this like buffer. And so it's been a really good buffer for me.
That sounds great. And I know exactly what you mean about that transition between being everything that your kids need and then just getting to see your husband for the evening.
Yes.
Yeah.
I also see one of my favorites, my She Reads Truth Bible. I got it for Christmas this year and I'm just loving it. And I don't know if it's because I'm finding myself with a little bit more time than I have in the last 10 years to spend some time reading the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I'm just loving being in it. And like the Bible, the She Reads Truth Bible specifically, like it's beautiful to look at. But it's a version that I also haven't read before. And so I almost feel like it's kind of coming alive to me in a way that I haven't read it in a while. And so, yeah, it is fresh and renewing.
I also asked for the She Reads Truth Bible for Christmas. I did not get it.
Oh,
I bought it for myself
sad.
in January.
Good. Good for you.
Yeah, so I'm liking it too. And I'm actually it's called the Bible Recap.
Yeah, I've heard of this.
Which is a podcast. Yeah. Have you heard of it?
Yeah.
So you read, it's chronological, and you read the chapters that are laid out for that day. And then you get a 7 to 10 minute recap from Tara Lee Cobble, just about what you read. And sometimes she's just reviewing kind of what you read and you already knew. And sometimes she gives you these wonderful insights. And it's really bringing it alive for me. I like it so much. Yeah. If you don't already have a Bible reading plan, or if you want to get into something like that, I highly recommend it. Favorite number 4.
Yeah. The Enneagram. And I know, like, I feel like everyone's going Enneagram crazy right now. But my husband and I were given some books, I think with The Road Back to You, and then followed it up with The Path Between Us, Suzanne Stabile, and then co-written the other one with Ian Morgan Cron. And it has just been so good for me individually and just helping to understand my core motivations and things that my longings and those things that I am hardwired to have, and that those are good things, but then also kind of helping to recognize the things that can trip me up and where I can get stuck. So it was really helpful to me to get to know myself and honestly be a little bit more comfortable in my bones.
Mm-hmm.
But also in my relationships, like it has been really helpful tool in my marriage in understanding my husband, kind of how he operates and how I can best speak his language and understand his struggle. I think that's a huge part, is understanding other people's struggle and how that manifests itself in relationships. So
what's your 5th favorite, Sarah?
5th. And this kind of goes back to the bubble baths. After that buffer, I like spending time with my husband, and we've started this new thing called Sushi Sunday.
Ooh.
Yeah, and don't, it's not like, we're not bougie. It's like sushi from Kroger that one of us goes out and grabs earlier in the day. We just have found that with 4 kids, it's really hard for us to go out for date night.
Yes.
More than probably once a month. And so we have just committed to Sunday nights being our stay-in date night, where once the kids get in bed, we, sit and have sushi. That's kind of our go-to. Once in a while, we'll do Mexican, but usually sushi. And just kind of get on the same page and have an actual conversation before we start a new, crazy, fast-paced, chaotic week.
I like that.
Yeah. And it's been really, really good to just know that we have that built-in time together.
Sarah, thank you so much for coming on today. I'm so glad you joined me on Girls Talking Life. I appreciate you sharing your story It was not easy. You saw me wiping my tears and I saw you, but it's so important and it's so meaningful the way God showed up in your life. And I love that you're using the loss and the grief that you experienced to glorify Him.
Yeah, thank you. I pray that if there's anyone who has experienced any or is experiencing, will experience, because life is going to come at us one way or another sometime, and just pray that it can point them to just hanging on to God.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Sarah. I know I've said this before, but she is someone who I instantly felt connected to and who I hope to sit down with face to face for an in-person coffee date sometime soon. Everything we talked about can be found in the show notes for today's episode on girlstalkinglife.com. While you're there, be sure to sign up for the newsletter. This will ensure that you don't miss an episode because the show notes, including all the links from everything we talked about, will be delivered right to your inbox. You will also get free downloadable conversation cards to use at your next gathering with your girlfriends. Do you know someone who might enjoy this podcast? Would you share it with them this week? And remember, don't let the conversation stop when the show is over. Share your stories and start your own conversations with the girls in your life. Thanks for tuning in.